In February, hundreds of protesters took to the streets across France to protest Bollore's empire, the sprawling media business conglomerate owned by Vincent Bollore. The protesters smashed papier-mâché copies of his head and shouted about his colonial behavior in Africa. At the same time, very cordial negotiations were taking place in Johannesburg, where Vincent Bollore was bidding to add Multichoice, including DStv, to his media empire. Vincent Bollore was going to control the main TV subscription services in both Francophone and Anglophone Africa. Bollore is not viewed as a colonizer in South Africa. In fact, thanks to the press language barrier, very little is known about him at all. Bollore is famous in France for his corruption scandals and attacks on critical journalists. He has supported West African dictators, influenced elections in exchange for contracts, invested in exploitative plantations, and sued anyone who complains about it. If the Multichoice deal is done, it could have serious political consequences for Africa as a whole. This is the story of how a French family built an African media empire. Vincent Bollore was born into a Breton business family with connections to the Rothschilds. His parents had made their fortune with a paper business, specializing in thin sheets for Bibles and cigarettes. By the 1970s, the business was on the edge of collapse. Using money earned as a banker, Bollore bought out the business for 2 francs. Standing on a pile of pallets on the factory floor, the 29-year-old promised to not fire any staff on the condition they agreed to a reduction in salaries. His charm and apparent sincerity carried the day. Bollore Papermakers became a plastic sheet manufacturing business. By 35, Bollore had turned the failing business into a booming industry, exporting to the United States. Profits from plastics were invested into new ventures, including ports and the energy sector. Within 10 years, he was a billionaire. The newspapers called him the Prince of the Cash Flow. Africa was like a drug to the Bollore empire. From the 1980s, investments in Africa brought the biggest profit margins. By 2017, roughly 80% of the group's income came from businesses on the continent. However, like every drug, there was a cost. For Bollore, it was his reputation. By 1988, he started to invest in the Rival Group, which controlled massive plantation holdings in West Africa. In public, he gave these activities a veneer of development. Africa, he claimed, was the Korea of the 21st century. Careful observers noticed many of the countries he was investing in were former French colonies, and the industries and infrastructure he was taking control of were created during the colonial era. By 1990, Bollore had a significant stake in Caralma, which had a de facto monopoly on the buying and selling of tobacco in Madagascar, Senegal, Gabon, Chad, and the Central African Republic. Comprising just 5% of the Bollore Group's activities, Caralma supplied 25% of its profit in 1993. Like Unilever, Bollore discovered a lot of money could be made from African consumers. For the expat staff employed by Bollore in Africa, there was a sense of adventure, a frontier spirit. Ange Mancini, a former French policeman who Bollore employed to run a railway in West Africa, would describe the company culture as a camp of gypsies. Outrage over Bollore's African activities soon manifested in France. Protesters were less worried about the cigarette sales and more concerned about child workers and deforestation on the plantations. By buying the Rival Group in 1996, Bollore had acquired a controlling stake in Socfin, a massive multinational palm oil plantation company with Belgian colonial roots. Socfin had tens of thousands of hectares under its control in Ghana, Nigeria, Sao Tome, DRC, Ivory Coast, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. However, it's in Cameroon where Socfin's power is greatest. There it has a practical monopoly on the buying of palm nuts, with small-scale farmers often intimidated by plantation security staff. Uncovering the crude roots of Bollore's profits was not hard. French journalists simply had to fly into Cameroon and talk to a couple of informal labourers on a palm oil plantation. What they found was unsurprising: poverty, no safety equipment, some young teenagers, and stories of abuse. Unfortunately, this Western outrage was somewhat misplaced. Bollore had a major investment in Socfin, but he had not created the Cameroon plantations. He was making money from a pre-existing system of oppression. His truly nefarious activities took place behind closed doors. It's in the logistics sector that the Bollore Group showed itself to be an active menace to the continent's development. From 1999, Bollore began building a transport empire which would eventually cover over 40 African countries and include 15 ports. Winning competitive bids to run West Africa's shipping is not easy. Many companies would like to run the Atlantic ports, which supply landlocked countries in the Sahel as well. Bollore gained an edge by appealing to the selfish concerns of his African contacts, politicians with short-term thinking and greed and power on the brain. In Guinea, Bollore offered to help President Alpha Condé win the 2010 elections in exchange for a favourable port deal. Euro RSCG, a political consultancy owned by Havas, a Bollore Group media company, was subcontracted to advise Condé's campaign. In Togo, Bollore offered a similar votes for ports deal to authoritarian leader Faure Gnassingbé, who was also worried about upcoming elections. This one came back to bite. 10 years later, a court in France would try him for the bribery and election interference. The case is ongoing. Andrew Weir has shown how even in less famous cases, for example Ghana, the actions of the Bollore Group continued to skirt the margins of legality. Sources suggest Bollore's Ghanaian associate agreed to subcontract some of the work to an engineering company run by the president's brother. The port deal in Ghana was so unfavourable to the government that the next administration was forced to renegotiate it. Bollore generously allowed the government to buy back shares at an exorbitant price. It was in Africa much of Bollore's fortune was forged. In Africa he grew his wealth from a few billion to 10 billion. He used former colonial business networks to expand his influence at first. Later he learned to work with selfish local politicians to strike favourable deals. However, the reputational cost has been heavy. Court cases and protests dog Bollore and his African empire. In recent years he has tried to cut links between himself and the ports. Bollore Logistics was taken over by his son Cyril and finally sold off for a hefty profit. Perhaps Vincent Bollore's greatest weakness is hypersensitivity about his reputation. French journalists who investigated what was happening in Africa were intimidated and threatened with legal action. It should be no surprise that as Africa operations drew heat, Bollore increasingly invested in media companies to control the narrative about his behaviour. Don't spit on the hand that fed you. Shut up, you jerk. You piece of shit. Not many TV presenters can get away with language like this, and Cyril Hanouna was quickly handed a hefty fine for his treatment of left-wing politician Louis Boyard. The 2022 debate on Don't Touch My Set was supposed to be about migrant rights. Instead, a small comment referencing the Bollore Group in Africa quickly spiraled into a 10-minute shouting match. Hanouna unshakably defended Bollore, shouting over Louis Boyard and accusing him of being anti-French, a liar, and disloyal. Behind the explosion of passion lay a darker reality. C8, the channel which broadcast the show, was owned by the Bollore Group. In fact, Don't Touch My Set was the brainchild of Cyril Hanouna and Yannick Bollore, one of Vincent Bollore's sons. Bollore has been investing in media from before 2010, buying shares in Vivendi and Havas. His presence has become more noticeable in France, where he took direct control of Canal+ in 2015. Writers on satirical shows who had mocked Bollore in the past, for example Les Guignols, were immediately fired. This attempt to censor or intimidate critical voices was not confined to France. Canal+ Afrique is a major TV channel across Francophone Africa. In 2017, it released a documentary titled Togo, Leave the Throne. The documentary chronicled the spontaneous protests against Faure Gnassingbé's government, which were brutally crushed by police. The Gnassingbé family has ruled Togo since 1967. They are also key contacts of Vincent Bollore, who benefited from a generous Togolese port deal. Several days after its release, the documentary was removed from all Canal+ channels and the website. Apparently, instructions were given internally. 2 employees were also fired. An anonymous source told Reporters Without Borders that the staff were told, "From now on at Canal, we don't talk about wealth, we don't talk about banks, we don't talk about Africa." Alongside this censorship drive was a new political slant. In the build-up to elections in 2022, Cyril Hanouna invited candidates like Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen onto his show. Parts of the French establishment were horrified. Bollore's romance with the right eventually landed him in hot water. By 2025, C8 was simultaneously France's most controversial and popular TV channel. 2 million viewers regularly tuned in to Don't Touch My Set with Cyril Hanouna. In February 2025, C8 was banned. Many journalists were strangely quiet. Perhaps some relished the idea that Bollore the bully was finally getting a taste of his own medicine. The censor had been censored. Bollore was always careful with the media. As he has grown older, he has done fewer and fewer interviews, and so journalists are left to speculate whether the move right is the result of long-held ideology or another pragmatic strategy to secure his fortune and protect his reputation. Perhaps it's a little bit of both. Ex-cop Ange Mancini would remember Bollore as the king of the gypsies in Africa. All things were permitted for profit, as long as everyone was loyal to Bollore. An anonymous employee of Canal Plus told a journalist, "Bollore has the right of life or death over his subjects. It's insane. Either you leave with a check or keep your head down and he makes you rich." Depressingly, Bollore's immense success in Africa has only been possible because corrupt leaders with short-term thinking have chosen to do deals with him. Far too many elected politicians in Africa have been content to keep their head down and become rich. François Hollande gave a darker analysis. "I think we should distrust Bollore. Not only politically, those who have not distrusted him are dead. He's a pirate." A rival billionaire described him as a thug. "He rooked me, tricked me, and humiliated me. I will never forget it." This dark side of the Catholic Breton earned him a famous nickname, the Smiling Killer. He was, most of his enemies agreed, a liar. In a rarely candid interview in his office in 1999, Bollore showed his guest a framed photo on his desk. It depicted a man being eaten alive by a boa constrictor. "That is reality," he said calmly. "That man was unlucky enough to fall asleep in the forest. Then he was eaten." This ruthless, two-faced willingness to do anything to get ahead is what allowed Bollore to turn a failing paper company into a post-colonial business empire. Unfortunately, he has not mellowed with age. In 2018, one of Bollore's associates told the journalist his controlling behavior had gotten worse. "These last years I have seen him transform, becoming more and more authoritarian and entering into a kind of all-powerfulness. Bollore today is like Louis XIV and his royal court." In the light of this, Anglophone Africans should ask themselves seriously if Vincent Bollore is someone they want running their media. If the deal does go through, they can expect censorship, political favoritism, coverage which benefits dictators, the decline of satire, and so much more. All coming to DStv in October, broadcasting from Nigeria to South Africa, and everywhere in between.